about it, right? But today what we're going to be discussing is King Baldwin IV, the Leper King. For those of you that don't know, he was destined to become the King of Jerusalem. The common theme between our last episode and today is the uh, concept of destiny, the manifest destiny by God himself. So let's go ahead and have a look at King Baldwin.
Few episodes in the history of the Crusades are so tragic as William of Tyre's discovery that his pupil, Prince Baldwin, the future king of Jerusalem, was suffering from leprosy.
So leprosy was considered God's punishment.
To be a strong and highly capable ruler who defended his kingdom from its greatest enemy, Saladin.
Very true. Very, very true. So he defeated Saladin once, and he managed to keep Jerusalem from Saladin for a very long time.
In 1170, Amalric, king of Jerusalem, selected William, the future Archbishop of Tyre, to be the tutor of his son and heir, Prince Baldwin. In his chronicle, William writes, "The boy, then about 9 years old, was accordingly committed to my care to be instructed and nurtured in liberal studies. While he was under my charge, I devoted myself to my royal pupil with vigilant care and watched over him with the solicitude befitting his exalted position. He was playing one day with his companions of noble rank, when they began, as playful boys often do, to pinch each other's arms and hands with their nails. The other boys gave evidence of pain by their outcries, but Baldwin, although his comrades did not spare him, endured it altogether too patiently, as if he felt nothing. At first, I supposed that it proceeded from his capacity for endurance, and not from his lack of sensitivity. But when
So yeah, a common theme in leprosy is not being able to feel any pain. Right, so that was a common symptom, and that's how you could sort of see if somebody had leprosy back in the day.
I called him over, I discovered that his right arm and hand were partially numb. The lad's father was informed of his condition, and physicians were consulted. It is impossible to refrain from tears while speaking of this great misfortune. William tells us that, despite Baldwin's illness, he showed incredible promise as a young prince. He was keenly intelligent and already an excellent horseman. He loved history, had a rather quiet personality, but took much interest in the organization and governance of the kingdom. Baldwin was barely 13 when his father, King Amalric, a wise and capable ruler, died in 1174. The nobles and clergy of the high court gathered together, and on July 15th, 1174, 75 years to the day since the First Crusade captured Jerusalem, Baldwin IV was crowned King of Jerusalem in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Because of his young age, Baldwin would at first have a regent. This role went to Raymond III, Count of Tripoli. Raymond and the kingdom's other leading men knew that Baldwin, as a leper, would never marry and produce heirs. To address the issue of the succession, Raymond married Baldwin's sister, Princess Sibylla, to William Longsword, Marquis of Montferrat, in 1176. As cousin to both the Holy Roman Emperor and the King of France, Longsword was a politically excellent choice as Sibylla's one-day consort. The marital alliance arranged by Raymond was as sound as Baldwin II's wedding of his daughter Melisande to Count Fulk of Anjou. However, within a year, William Longsword fell ill and died, leaving the 17-year-old Sibylla pregnant with his child.
So, if anybody has seen Kingdom of Heaven, Queen Sibylla herself had a leper son. So the genes passed on, right? And policy, politics, and marriage was a common phenomenon back in the day.
This only compounded the problem, for Longsword's death extinguished the idea that he might step in as the strong leader the kingdom required when Baldwin the Leper eventually died. Sibylla's pregnancy meant that her next husband would have to accept that his own
common
children would be
phenomenon
unlikely to inherit the kingdom, and few of
unstable internal politics from the West, from the Christians, is seen.
Amid all of these dynastic uncertainties, factions were developing within the court of Jerusalem. One faction was led by Count Raymond of Tripoli. Another faction was developing around Baldwin's mother, and Reynald of Châtillon, the powerful lord of the kingdom's most important eastern border territory, Transjordan.
Western ambition
However,
that basically
when
led to the
Raymond's
destruction
regency
of
ended in
Jerusalem.
1176, on Baldwin's 15th birthday, the young king began to prove himself quite capable of holding his own. Baldwin IV's first great challenge would come from the east. Saladin, Sultan of Egypt and Damascus.
So Saladin ultimately does take Jerusalem, but he takes it after King Baldwin has died. And the reason why he did it after was because, one, he knew military strategy, right? He was the only Muslim leader at that point in time that understood the concept of military strategy. Two, it was after King Baldwin's death. And three, it was at a point where there was a power vacuum between leadership within Jerusalem. So it was fragmented and it was easy for him to take the city without having much opposition.
Was the greatest enemy faced by the kingdom of Jerusalem. In the late summer of 1176, Saladin was an enormously powerful figure in the Saracen world. He had just defeated one of his rivals, Saif ad-Din, when he realized that a large Crusader force under the recently arrived Count Philip of Flanders was attacking Harim.
So this is true, he was the leader of the Saracens.
Saladin used this opportunity to attack the kingdom of Jerusalem in the south. It was the autumn of 1177, and Saladin, with an enormous army numbering in the tens of thousands, suddenly appeared before the Crusader city of Ascalon. King Baldwin IV at once assembled what troops he could find. Many of the kingdom's knights had gone north to join Philip of Flanders. So heavily outnumbered, Baldwin at first retreated into the walls of Ascalon, leaving Saladin's enormous army free to ravage and pillage the kingdom, almost to the very walls of Jerusalem itself. It must have been a terrifying scene, as Saladin's men torched villages and peasants fled in panic from the Sultan's marauding troops. The citizens of Jerusalem, huddled within the Tower of David, were terrified that Saladin might even take their city. Because Baldwin's army was so small, Saladin was unconcerned about a counterattack.
We're talking about 2,000, 3,000 men.
His troops to spread out through the countryside. But Baldwin was determined to respond to Saladin's attack with force. The young Leper King emerged from Ascalon and prepared to strike back. Baldwin's army was small, but filled with very capable fighters. It included a force of Knights Templar under their Grand Master, Odo of Saint-Amand. Balian of Ibelin and his knights were present as well, along with Reynald of Chatillon and his men from Transjordan. On November 25th,
Balian also led the defense of Jerusalem after King Baldwin's death.
William of Tyre describes the battle that followed. The ranks of fighters on both sides now gradually approached each other, and a battle ensued, which was at first indecisive, but the forces were very unequal. The Christians, however, strengthened by the grace shed upon them from on high, soon began to press on with ever-increasing boldness. Saladin's lines were broken and, after a terrible slaughter, were forced to flee.
So again, the Christians fought as if God was on their side, and God was on their side.
The Templars played a particularly important role in this regard.
King Baldwin himself called this victory a miracle.
Men fleeing in disorder. Baldwin's cavalry chased the scattering enemy all the way to a nearby marsh. According to the chronicler Ibn al-Athir, one group of Crusader knights got so close to Saladin that his own bodyguard of Mamluks had to hold them off. Saladin himself, fearing for his life, scrambled onto a racing camel and fled to safety. The Crusader knights pursued the scattering Saracens until nightfall. The victory was total. Saladin lost the vast bulk of his army, and indeed barely escaped with his own life. Only the courage of his Mamluk bodyguards, willing to die themselves so that their master could escape, and the swiftness.
So what's important to note is that with the equal force that King Baldwin thought God was on his side, Saladin thought that Allah was on his side to take Jerusalem. And that was significantly important for the time, which is why he had a lot of Saracens willing to sacrifice themselves for his protection, because he was the leader that was supposed to bring back Jerusalem to the Muslims.
Of a racing camel saved his life. Saladin had dangerously underestimated the 16-year-old Leper King. Baldwin IV, despite his illness, had rallied a small but formidable force and led them to victory against a dangerous enemy. Baldwin was no longer merely a boy king. but now a warrior king, tested and found ready for the challenge of a full-on invasion from the most powerful Saracen enemy ever faced by the Kingdom of Jerusalem. In our next video, part 2, and the final part in this series on the life of King Baldwin IV, we'll examine the final portion of the Leper King's
So,
reign.
I mean, who could really doubt this king? Who could really doubt a king that faced the most formidable source of power and won, even though he was a leper at that young age? It's quite an important factor, right? The impact he had at the leadership at the time. Which from his noblemen would challenge him? Which from the foreign kings in Europe would challenge such a king that managed to protect, even though overpowered, Jerusalem, holy Jerusalem?
To counter Saladin's pressure on the kingdom's eastern frontier, Baldwin, in cooperation with the Knights Templar, began constructing a castle at Jacob's Ford on the Jordan River in October of 1178. The Templars, with their castle at Safad, already had a strong presence in the region and were the logical force to garrison the new castle. Most of the construction was carried out over a 6-month period, while Saladin was besieging Ibn al-Muqaddam at Baalbek. In June of 1179, Saladin invaded the kingdom's lands to the east of Sidon. King Baldwin assembled his army at Tiberias, marching north to stop Saladin's raid. Initially, Saladin's forces were driven off, but the Crusaders were unaware that Saladin had not struck with his main army. Later, Saladin did attack with a much larger force kept in reserve, inflicting severe losses on some of the Crusader forces which were caught unprepared.
So the reality is that Saladin was not as patient as was seen as Kingdom of Heaven. He was actually quite anxious because of his own internal politics to be able to take Jerusalem. He did possess an extra layer of military strategy in comparison with the rest of the Saracen leadership at the time, so the rest of the Muslim leadership at the time, including the Turks, the Ottoman Turks. But he was unique in terms of manpower, strategy, and deception.
Among those captured
This was matched equally by Baldwin, by the way, as well.
was the Templars' Grand Master, Odo of Saint-Amand, one of the heroes of Montgassard. Saladin followed up this victory by attacking and capturing the castle at Jacob's Ford in August. The Sultan brutally slaughtered the roughly 700 prisoners taken at the castle. But as his army withdrew to Damascus, disease spread among their ranks, killing large numbers of Saladin's men, including 10 of his chief emirs. For the Christians, this was God's vengeance. Meanwhile, Baldwin IV's leprosy was worsening. William of Tyre tells us that each day the signs of the king's disease increased. Baldwin knew well that his own life would not continue much longer, and the urgency of the succession was forefront in his mind. He was determined to arrange a worthy marriage for his sister, Princess Sibylla. He decided in the spring of 1180 to marry Sibylla to Guy of Lusignan, younger brother to the kingdom's new constable, Aimri of Lusignan.
So according to the movie Kingdom of Heaven, he originally offered her to Balian, and Balian refused because he's in good conscience. This would have led to some executions from people that were Templars that were against the original orders, and the orders were to maintain the peace with the Saracens.
Guy was a newcomer and rather unknown, and the king's decision came as a shock to many. William of Tyre deeply disapproved of Baldwin's choice, describing Guy as a man with neither the character nor judgment to rule. In explaining Baldwin's seemingly hasty selection of Guy, William states that the king believed that the Count of Tripoli, Raymond III, and Prince Bohemond III of Antioch intended to dethrone him. By quickly securing the succession, Baldwin made this coup impossible. Guy and Sibylla's marriage deepened the divisions within the upper nobility.
Naturally, because Guy was seen as an unworthy leader.
While the powerful Ibelin family was equally unhappy with the marriage. The eldest of the Ibelin sons, Baldwin of Ramla, had apparently been Raymond and Bohemond's choice to marry Sibylla. Meanwhile, Guy
that would have been the best choice.
Focal point for the court faction led by King Baldwin's mother, Agnes,
and it would have been the best choice because it would have basically ensured that there was a second front line of knights that protected the outskirts of Jerusalem. So the Balian family basically had a series of knights that protected the outskirts of Jerusalem. It would have been strategically much more coherent. The reason why historically he did not do it, again, not based on the movie, but historically he did not do it, was the fear that essentially he would be dethroned, and or that they wanted to dethrone him, so it was more of a vindictive move. Again, we see a common theme here between this, the first Crusades, and what's later to come, second, third, and so forth and so on. And that's the division within nobility, power, and the Christianic movement. This has transcended beyond that time into modernity, and it's quite visible till this very day, right? And that's also why we see a lot of Saracen victories, then followed by the second and third and fourth Crusade. A lot of Saracen takeover of modern West as we speak. So the impact is quite significant, and the impact is because of internal domestic struggles, right? So if the West manages to unite, putting aside politics, then the force that could become a force that could take over the world, right? A formidable force that undoubtedly could match any adversary. The thing is, we don't really see that because we focus a lot on the internal power struggles, and we'll deal with that problem when it comes.
Included Reynald of Chatillon and Aymery of Lusignan. This pronounced factionalism sprung from the uncertainty and urgency brought on by the king's leprosy. In the summer of 1182, King Baldwin the Leper again faced the challenge of an invasion by Saladin. The Sultan took full advantage of his possession of both Egypt and Damascus. Saladin dispatched a contingent from Damascus, which captured 500 villagers near Mount Tabor. Saladin now attacked the kingdom in Galilee. Baldwin kept the Jerusalem army in the field, opposing Saladin's advance. The two forces faced off in a brutal engagement known as the Battle of Belvoir Castle. The weather was crushingly hot, and many died from heat exhaustion on both sides. However, King Baldwin and the Crusaders won the day, repelling Saladin and obliging him to retreat.
So what's important to note is that the Leper King, up until now, has not been defeated.
Which he used to attack the important Crusader port of Beirut. Once again, King Baldwin responded rapidly, assembling the land army while the kingdom's fleet was launched from Acre and Tyre. Saladin was forced to withdraw his attack, and Beirut was saved. Saladin spent the autumn attacking his Muslim enemies, the Zengids. King Baldwin took the opportunity of Saladin's absence to raid the Sultan's territories around Damascus. King Baldwin had commanded brilliantly during 1182's hard campaigning, but he and the kingdom's nobles knew that Saladin's immense power would continue to pose a deadly threat. In February 1183, Reynald of Chatillon launched a raid against Saladin into the Red Sea, harassing some of the Sultan's vital trading links. In a move of striking boldness, Reynald and a small force carried several ships in pieces overland across the desert to launch them on the Gulf of Aqaba. The ships were separated into two squadrons, with one besieging Aqaba, a fortress known to the Muslims as the Head of the Sea, while the other raided along the coast of Hijaz. At Aidhab, on the western edge of the Red Sea, merchants were captured and goods seized. Saladin was horrified that Reynald could assault such vital trading links so near to Mecca and Medina. He quickly launched a fleet from Cairo to suppress Reynald's campaign. Saladin's admiral, Hussam al-Din Lulu, captured and killed Reynald's men at Aqaba, then pursued the others along the coast. Reynald and a band of his men withdrew, but the rest of his contingent was trapped in a ravine by Hussam's forces after being driven from their ships. Every prisoner taken was executed, for Saladin didn't want anyone with such intimate knowledge of the Red Sea trading ports to make it back alive to the Kingdom of Jerusalem, where their knowledge might be valuable in a future campaign. Saladin cited Reynald's Red Sea campaign as his reason for attacking Kerak in 1183, although we have to keep in mind that Saladin, committed to the jihad, wanted to destroy the Kingdom of Jerusalem regardless of Reynald's activities. That same month, Patriarch Heraclius dispatched a letter to all the great kingdoms of the West, begging for their help in the defense of the Crusader states. The Christians' concerns proved well-founded, for in June of that year, Saladin finally captured Aleppo from the Zengids. Now, the Sultan truly controlled all the territory surrounding the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Meanwhile, Baldwin's illness had gotten much worse. The situation was so serious that the High Court felt it urgent that a new regent be appointed in Baldwin's place. Baldwin selected his brother-in-law, Guy of Lusignan. In September of 1183, Saladin made his next move. Assembling a vast army, the Sultan crossed the Jordan south of the Galilee. The Crusaders were prepared, assembling what William of Tyre describes as the kingdom's largest army in living memory. Under Guy's leadership, the army encamped where they were well supplied with water. Over the course of 9 days, there was fierce sparring between the Christians and Saladin's Ayyub.
So water was a significant factor during the Crusades, right? Both campsites could not move away from water. The Saracens had an advantage because they knew the area better, and they were more adapted to the conditions of the area. But nevertheless, both being human, they both needed water sources. So you see this as a very common phenomenon. Most battles are taking place around water sources.
Host. Above all, Saladin wanted to provoke a pitched battle, but Guy would not commit his forces to it, maintaining a defensive posture to limit Saladin's movements. Finally, Saladin gave up and retreated to Damascus. Once again, Saladin had been repelled, but King Baldwin was dissatisfied with Guy's performance. The king felt that Guy had missed a good opportunity to inflict a serious defeat on Saladin.
So yes, that would have solved potentially the taking of Jerusalem, right? It would have still belonged to the Christian leadership. Had Guy followed, pursued, and actively dismantled a good amount of Saladin's army, then he could have potentially dealt with that problem immediately.
According to William of Tyre, Saladin had been reckless and had left himself open to potential disaster. Dismissing Guy as regent, Baldwin took back the power directly to himself. But barely a month after his last attack, Saladin struck again, this time in the eastern border territory of Transjordan. Saladin brought a large army to besiege the great fortress of Kerak, the chief.
So what's really interesting is that Saladin was using a combination of guerrilla warfare with sieges, right? So he was sieging and guerrilla attacking random points within the Kingdom of Jerusalem that would strategically have an impact on the enemy. Now, Guy did not see that strategy, and had he seen that strategy, he should have dismantled the Saladin's army beforehand. Baldwin, on the other hand, understood what Saladin was doing, part of jihad, or guerrilla besiegement, and wanted to deal with it with as strong of an impact as fast as possible. So every opportunity he got, he wanted to completely dismantle Saladin.
Castle of Reynald of Chatillon. Kerak was one of the most strategically crucial strongholds in the kingdom, guarding the eastern approach to Jerusalem and allowing the Crusaders to patrol the roads between Egypt and Damascus. Armed with the true cross, King Baldwin raised his army once again.
The army of Jerusalem has come.
Day and night, Saladin's trebuchets pounded at Kerak, but the castle was well fortified and prepared for a long resistance. Once Saladin knew that the army of Jerusalem was on the way, he called off the siege and retreated in the first days of December 1183.
So Saladin understood that he could not face that army alone.
Brutally difficult for King Baldwin. By now, his leprosy was so debilitating that at one point he had to hand command over to Count Raymond of Tripoli. By early 1185, King Baldwin's condition had become critical. It was clear to all that their long-suffering king would not recover this time. Baldwin assembled the kingdom's barons, asking them to recognize Count Raymond as regent until his own nephew, Baldwin V, son of Sibylla, would be old enough to rule. Should the child Baldwin die early, the kings of France and England, along with the Holy Roman Emperor, were to pass judgment on the succession. Above all, Baldwin IV wanted to be sure that his sister Sibylla and her husband Guy would not take the throne after his death, for by now the king was convinced of their unfitness to reign. At last, on March 16th, 1185,
and he was right.
Baldwin IV died in Jerusalem, mourned
They were unfit to
throughout
reign.
his realm. Despite his leprosy, Baldwin IV of Jerusalem ruled wisely in the most trying of times. During his reign, Saladin was at the height of his power and had enormous resources with which to threaten the kingdom. Baldwin ensured that every time Saladin attacked, he was challenged by the army of Jerusalem. Thus, during Baldwin's reign, the kingdom was safe and Saladin's attempts at conquest were thwarted. For a man dying of leprosy, commanding a state short of men and funds, faced up against a hostile and much larger power bent on conquest, Baldwin IV must truly be admired.
So yes, that is in fact true. So Baldwin is potentially one of the greatest military generals that this world has seen. I'm going to do an episode on Alexander the Great and many others too, but for the time being, he is one of the greatest military strategists that the world has ever seen. He had close to zero resources. He understood his enemy's strategy, and he made sure to deal with it with an iron fist. So realpolitik. Every time he was challenged, he would face off the whole army of Jerusalem. He knew how to do strategic hits, and he basically waited out the patience of Saladin. It's one of the reasons why Jerusalem fell after his death. But up until that point, and had he had no leprosy, there was absolutely no doubt in my mind that Jerusalem would have remained Christian. Thanks for watching this. I hope you really enjoyed it. Feel free to let us know of any feedback. I'd appreciate it. So we could take it from there and see how we can improve. Have a great day, everyone.